Hey everybody, I'm the Drink Pro, and today I'm drinking Glenfarclas 105. Hey everybody, Kyle the Drink Pro here with you yet again. As always, thank you so much for liking these videos, commenting on them to share your thoughts, subscribing to the channel, that helps more than you realize, and joining me on the Patreon where you can get exclusive content, merch, and so much more for a small monthly fee. This channel wouldn't exist without you guys, so I appreciate all of your support immensely. Thank you so much. Today, we are trying out a pour that I've had on my shelf for a long time. With apologies to Josh Taylor, it's taken me far too long to review some of the scotches that he has provided me. I won't tell you when I received this, but let's just say it's been a long time. Josh runs a whiskey group on Facebook, I Drink and I Know Things whiskey group. He also has a podcast now. He's on Instagram. Here is his handle. Check him out. He's a good dude. He helped me out. He was a really important supportive figure early on in this channel that encouraged me to push hard and keep going. So that's the kind of people you need in your life. You need good people like that to drink with. So go find them, come drink with me and many others like me, I hope. The Glenfarclas Distillery is in the Speyside region in Scotland, although I will say that on their bottles, Glenfarclas 105 is listed as a Highland Scotch. I looked into this a little bit and it turns out that a lot of people consider the islands and Speyside regions of Scotland as sub-regions of the Highlands. So I learned something. You know, I'm not as well versed in Scotch naturally as I am in bourbon, just based on my own personal history and interests. So you learn something every day. That's part of being a professional, is to keep learning and keep growing and admit when you don't know things. The 105 actually stands for the proof point in the British proof system. It's 60% alcohol by volume, but that proof point historically was 105 proof. Glenfarclas 105 actually was the first barrel-proof single malt whiskey in Scotland. So it's a cool history of this bottle, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it tastes today. Like I said, it's at 60% alcohol, so I got a little bit of water. We might need to tamper this down a bit depending on how the flavors present. Before we get into this too far, I want to give you some history about Glenfarclas. Glenfarclas was actually purchased by a man named John Grant in 1865 for just over 511 pounds. That was how much money he spent to buy the farm and the distillery itself. Since then, the distillery has continued in the family. Now the 5th and 6th generation Grants are running the distillery. So it's cool to see a family-owned distillery continue to exist in Scotland. A lot of distilleries are selling to large conglomerates, essentially, because it's a good way to reduce costs, it's a good way to improve distribution, but it's fun to see distilleries that still are family-owned, family-operated, and farms existing next to the distillery themselves. Now, Glenfarclas 105 is not an age-stated whiskey, but if you talk to people who are in the know, they suspect it's between 8 and 10 years old, and it's a mix of ex-bourbon barrel fill and ex-sherry fill casks. So you're going to have some sherry influence and some of that sweet bourbon influence. So it should be an interesting profile here. I don't think I've tasted this one before. Some of Josh's samples I've tasted in various videos that he and I did together, but I don't think I actually did formal video reviews of, so those will be coming in the near future. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and taste the Glenfarclas on its own. Ooh, it's got a good nose on it. So right off the bat, if I didn't know that this was a 60% alcohol whiskey, I would never guess that it was that high proof. It's very gentle and inviting on the nose. I get a lot of creamy spice cake almost. It's buttery. The sherry is there, but it's not as in your face as a lot of sherry finish or sherry aged whiskeys. The sherry is sort of subtle, and it combines with that bourbon finish to give you this sort of nice dark fruit sweetness, but also these baking spices and this honeyed quality that I always get from bourbon finished casks. The sherry in this is actually relatively subtle. It definitely shows up. You can tell there's a sherry quality, but it really presents more like this nice, sweet, dark fruit. I get cherries, maybe some raspberries, maybe some plums. It accompanies beautifully that classic bourbon barrel quality that you get in bourbon cask scotches, where you have this sort of creamy, baking spice, honeyed vibe. It's combining with the sherry fruity sweetness to create a beautiful dessert-like quality. Honestly, all put together, I'm almost getting like a raspberry tart. That's pretty cool. The proof on this, I can't believe it's 60% alcohol. It just does not show up on the nose at all. It's just that sweet fruit. Oh, that wonderful creaminess, a little bit of baking spice. If you've ever smelled or tasted sherried bourbons, this kind of reminds me of that. There's not a lot of sort of distinctly Scottish qualities in this. What I mean by that is this really distinct malty characteristics. Single malt scotches almost always have predominant malt flavors. Or you get this sort of sea breeze, salty, sometimes briny, sometimes smoky vibe, depending on where in Scotland the whiskey is coming from. So those kinds of notes really make it easy to distinguish between Scotch and bourbon. But this one, that quality is very muted, if existent at all. I guess there is sort of a creamy maltiness, but it's so next to this beautiful ripe cherry note that then pushes and blends into this dessert-like, dark fruit-like, honeyed. It's just such a beautiful nose on this. If you're somebody that enjoys sherried American whiskey, but you've never really found Scotch that you enjoyed, this could be a really good introduction because it's got so many classic bourbon notes, so much classic sherry influence, and the sort of quote-unquote Scotch qualities are really minimized. That doesn't mean it's not good or it isn't familiar to a Scotch drinker. It's just leaning much more heavily into a more classic bourbon profile and a classic sherried finish. Oh, I almost got like tropical fruit or pineapple that time. The nose on this is crazy. I could spend all day sitting around smelling this nose, digging for different notes, just bouncing around, but I want to get to the taste. I want to give this a shot. Here we go, guys. Cheers. Everything I said about bourbon drinkers, forget it. This is very Scotch on the palate. First thing you taste, definitely honey, definitely that malty sweetness, almost a cakey quality, but very quickly it moves into a more classic Scotch profile. I get pretty notable sea breeze, that salty briny quality. I'm always hesitant when I say that salty briny quality because it's not really briny. When I think of brine, I think of this almost sharp vinegary note, maybe even a medicinal note. That's what you're gonna get from some Islas and some of the island whiskeys and some Campbelltown pours, but this isn't really that, but it has this like ocean spray saltiness that I can't really put my finger on, and you accompany that with the malty sweetness. It's a very distinct note you get from a lot of Scotch whiskey. I think it's something that turns a lot of people off. When people say they don't like the peatiness or smokiness in Scotch whiskey, there's a good chance that that's actually what they're referring to, is that malty sea breeze combination, because peaty, smoky whiskeys are pretty much a minority. Even slightly peated whiskeys are out there, but you're a lot more likely to see a whole bunch of Scotches that have that sort of sea breeze quality mixed in with the malty flavors. That's what's turning people off. This is sort of an aside, but if you want to introduce people to Scotch that aren't going to like malt or are really opposed generally to the malt profile, give them a single grain whiskey. A lot of the whiskey coming out of Scotland is single grain whiskey, and that's going to remind them a lot more of what they're familiar with and comfortable with in American whiskeys and in bourbons. As soon as you get away from that sweet cakiness, it immediately transitions to this old bog wood, this deep, old, waterlogged. It's a really interesting flavor. It's got a hint of bitterness and a hint of a classic sharp barrel tannin woodiness, but the predominant note is just sort of like hard to describe. It's just this old, you can taste the age on it, this old wood, and it's surprising because it's not that old of a whiskey. You can definitely tell there's a wine finish on this. That sherry shows up really predominantly in the mid-palate end of the finish. It's almost bitter with like a tannin quality. Sherry can marry really well with other flavors, but I'm getting more sherry on the palate and not enough other whiskey elements. You don't get the sherry sweetness, which I think a lot of people want, but instead you get that sherry finish, that really distinct, almost dry tannic quality. I don't think this pour is for me. I'm probably not gonna buy a bottle of this, but I'm really glad I tried it. It's cool to see what else is out there and what's going on. I will say, if you like sherry in your whiskey, this might be a good option because it's gonna have a little bit woodier of a finish, but it's gonna be sherry wood, if that makes sense. It's like you can taste a sherry barrel in the mid-palate and finish of this. And the start is sweet enough that it reminds you of a bourbon, kind of, or at least a sweet Speyside Scotch. And then the transition into that sherry woody quality. So It's an interesting pour, it's a fun pour, it's not my thing, I'm not gonna buy it, but thank you so much, Josh, for providing me with this sample. You guys keep drinking like professionals. Cheers.